Right, we've done more than that. The workshops have been fully refurbished. We're going to come back into the workshops and I will explain much more about what we've done at that point, but we're going to start off by heading into the machine shop here. But before we go into the machine shop, I just need to talk a little bit about the history, because you can see it's a stone building. This was the original goods transshipment shed between road and rail. And you young man, what you have to realise is the railways were before the age of the transit van. We didn't get stuff delivered by transit van. If the draper in the high street had ordered a roll of cloth, it would have been delivered by rail, offloaded in here, probably from a rail wagon to a horse and cart, or later on a motor lorry. Yeah, and that's what this structure is. So it dates from the about 1860. Severn Valley Line opened in 1861. When the preservation guys started, none of this shed was here, so this was the only covered accommodation we had. It could just about get one small and one large locomotive in here. So if we head in here, there is a slight ramp as we go in. We head in here, then we'll talk a little bit about the machines that are in here.
That's a lathe and a half. It's a chunky lathe.
Oh. Chunky lathe, yeah? So I should ask at this point, is anybody on the tour an engineer or did engineering? You're an engineer today or did it earlier?
I'm retired now.
Retired engineer.
But old school, all this stuff.
Old school,
Lights,
yeah. Right. Well, John's an engineer. I'm not an engineer. I always say, give me a hammer and spanner and I can take most things off an engine and put most things back on, but I can't actually repair things. So in here, this is our machine shop. Now during the week, on the engineering staff, we employ about 20 people, including office administrators and so on. So we would have engineers working in here all the time, as well as in the boiler shop and out on the main shed. So this would be a busy place, quite a bit of noise with the machines running and so on. At weekends we sometimes have volunteer machinists in doing jobs, but obviously we haven't at the moment. All of these machine tools in here, the lathes, boring machines, milling machines, we acquired them all second hand, and it's probably fair to say if we hadn't bought them, they'd have either gone to scrap or perhaps been exported to India or China or somewhere like that. And they range from the small, so little Colchester lathe there, which is the sort of thing that our Severn Valley Railway apprentices learn a lot of their work on. They're the sort of lathe that you might have in a college or a school. So small things right up to this monster here. What did you call it? A chunky lathe. Yeah. So this is a wheel lathe. We can actually put locomotive wheels, that's 2 wheels and an axle, weighing up to 5 tons. The crane will take 5 tons. We can put them on there up to 6 foot 8 inches diameter. Now, I mentioned one of my voluntary roles is part of the Railways Health and Safety Committee. Trust me, this is, anybody here from Health and Safety? This is a health and safety man's nightmare, this machine, because the way you operate it is you physically have to climb on top of it. You can imagine a great big wheel, axle and another wheel there. They don't rotate fast, but they rotate, and the swarf and metal chips coming off. And the only way the operator can operate it is by standing right next to that rotating mass, which could be 3.5, 4 tons. There's no safety guard or anything like that. It is a health and safety man's nightmare. We don't use it very often. But it's the sort of machine that if we got rid of it, we'd never find another. This came out of the railway works at Derby. Yeah, we've used it many times and continue to use it to this day.
It's so old, it's actually a DC motor that drives it, and we have to have a converter at the back.
Right, let's move on in a little bit. always brings a chuckle when people see that they've been named Bill and Ben. So these are big boring machines. They can take things up to 48-inch, 4-foot diameter. Round the back, there's actually a plate that says they were built for the Admiralty, and I think it was 1942, 43, something like that. So I always have visions of them making bits for destroyers, cruisers, battleships, whatever. But they're used on a very regular basis. And what we've got in there at the moment, it's only a small job. That's what we call a bearing brass. It's not actually brass. It's made of a material called leaded gunmetal, which is the equivalent, nearest equivalent we can get these days to bronze. So they're machining that at the moment, and then it will have white metal moulded into it, and the white metal will then be machined. The white metal forms the actual bearing surface. White metal is a lead-based alloy. It's very easy to machine, very easy to cast things, and it's relatively cheap. So that forms the wearing surface, which can be replaced relatively easily. That brass there, as it's called, to buy that in its raw, unmachined form, you're looking at about £500 for that. The material prices are really quite high at the moment.
I was taught that was a bushing, not a bearing.
Well,
are we going to have an argument?
What industry was that in? Because in a railway, we call them a bearing.
Yeah, same thing.
We're not going to have an argument now.
But yeah, I was taught it was a bushing.
Right, okay. So if we move up this way. Right, so we've got little lathes like these Colchesters. We've got great big lathes like this one. The lathe I want to talk about is this one here, made by a company called Lang, nicknamed Gertie. Not all the machines in here have names. Bill and Ben have names, and Gertrude or Gertie has a name. Now, why am I going to talk about Gertie? Well, Gertie, about 4 years ago, the clutch plates between the motor and the gearbox, the clutch plates went, and the ladies in the admin office found a company in Halifax that could supply some spare parts. So they sent the details of the lathe, they sent the serial number, and the day after, a chap from this company in Halifax is on the phone and he said, "Can I just check that serial number because I think you've got a digit wrong?" They went through it and no, they got the right serial number, and he said, "I've got the Lang manufacturer's records back to the early 1920s, and your lathe precedes that by quite some margin." And he reckons that lathe is First World War. So we've got machine tools that are over 100 years old. That's older than most of our locomotives. But this is another Lang, bigger one. You can see how heavily constructed they are. Look at that compared to the one behind. The one behind almost looks like it's made of tin plate. These were built to last. Now they don't last indefinitely, but if they break, our engineers in here repair them themselves. You can't phone up a company in the Black Country and say we've got a 1918 lathe that needs repair. He will say, well, what electronics has it got? And we'll say it's got a stop-start button. That's the modern world versus what we try to do. If you look behind as we go out, we've got a few drills of different sizes. I bet your mum and dad haven't got drills that size at home, have they? And various components here. These are all bronze or leaded gunmetal for all being machined at the moment. So we'll come out this way. Morning, Oliver.
Morning, you right?
Yeah. So the main shed has been refurbished during the summer, but we are, for want of a better word, tarting up in here, hence the freshly painted walls, and we'll be moving storage racks and things back in here in the very near future. So we're now going to step outside for a few minutes. So the stone building, as I said, was built about 1860. The brick building next to it is the most recent addition to the works. That dates from the late 1980s. The whole site was developed in a very ad hoc manner. Originally the goods shed, then the main shed, which we'll see later on, then these sheds here, then the boiler shop. Now we're not going in the boiler shop today, A, because we haven't got time, and B, it's particularly congested. We've got a lot of stuff in there at the moment and it would be difficult to show a group of this size around. But what we're going to do now is we're going to walk round the back lane, which might seem a strange thing to do, but the reasons will become clear as we go. You're thinking, Phil? I think there's a bloke interested in buying that.
Is it?
Yeah.
All right.
Seriously, we've had 2 people ask us whether...
In that case, I'll put it back on again.
Right, we'll stop about here.
Is that your cherry picker over there?
Yes, that's a road railer one.
Oh yeah.
It's it can go on the road or the rails. It's used by the signalling department for maintenance. Yeah. So this might seem an odd place to stop, especially when I say I'm going to talk about this blue container behind it. But we've got one of these here and one at Kidderminster, and they have probably got the most important equipment that we use on the locos, and it's all to do with the water. So the pannier tank, the little black pannier tank that's running today, during the turn it's on, it will probably boil about 3,000 gallons of water today. Big tender loco will use more. That tank on the top of the hill, that holds 11,000 gallons. There's a similar sized tank at Kidderminster. But that tank is fed from the equipment in the blue container, and that's our water treatment plant. What's called a reverse osmosis plant. Reverse osmosis basically removes about 99.9% of the impurities from the water, whether that's lime scale, nitrates if the farmers have been dousing the fields, etc. So our water tank and what we put into the tanks of the locomotives which gets fed into the boiler is effectively about as pure water as you can get. I don't think we're in the market for towing glaciers or icebergs down here and melting them, but that's probably as pure a water as you can get. Now the reason why that's so important is because we found that our boilers were really deteriorating quite badly. You have to do a boiler overhaul every 10 years. That's a statutory requirement. The pressure vessel regulations require us to do a full strip down and examination. And things like lime scale might not seem to be particularly harmful. It might ruin your kettle every now and then. Any of you people from Bridge North? No? Bridge North apparently has some of the worst water in the country, and there's people who told me that they live in Bridge North and have to buy a new electric kettle every 6 months because it absolutely wrecks them. But lime scale in water, even though the boiler is a great big thing with lots of water in it, the water will actually circulate due to the thermic currents in there, and lime scale circulating will actually act as an abrasive, and it will cut grooves in steel plates. The nitrates and so on can be quite corrosive to the copper work in boilers and so on. So the RO plant, reverse osmosis plant, reduces that incredibly to the extent that our boiler overhauls aren't anything like as costly and as expensive as they used to be. Every now and then,
cost effective then, is it?
It is cost effective.
That what we choose.
When boilers coming down to about 6 years?
Yeah, they weren't lasting 10 years, the boilers. So the fact that we can get 10 years out of them, it's not cheap. I mean, one of the first things that we put in it is salt tablets. Now, a pallet of salt about that size, I'm just trying to think, I think it was £154 the last pallet of salt we bought, but we'll get through 2 of those a month in there. And then there's filters, there's maintenance, The maintenance contracts on these things, they're about £5,000 per annum per unit. They come and they service them every 6 months, and a service on that takes an engineer 2 days. It's quite complicated equipment.
Is there a waste product?
Yes, there is.
Yeah.
And sadly, it's water.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And we've got nowhere that we can actually store that water to use it for other purposes. They're not at all efficient. Yeah, it's about 60% of the water that goes into the system ends up in the tank.
Oh,
Right, the other reason we stopped here is to look at our shed. Now, it might just be cladding to you, but it's beautiful to me. Yeah. We'll talk a bit more about what we've done in the shed, but basically this summer we have completely reclad the roof, which was leaking, and the side walls. And the old shed was just single skin. This is insulated. It's got about 200mm or 8 inches of insulation in there, so the shed will be warmer for our staff working in there during the winter. Because you have to trust me at this point. Last winter, on one occasion, we'd had some rain or whatever, and there were puddles on the floor because the roof was leaking so badly. And the next morning, that was ice. Inside, it was ice. It was genuinely warmer outside than it was in. And the guys, you knew it when it was pretty bad in there because they were wearing 2 donkey jackets. And I'm not joking, they were honestly wearing 2 donkey jackets. And if you think then, they're working on if the ambient temperature is say 5 degrees in there, then a 100-ton locomotive is sat at 5 degrees. Everything you touch is cold to the touch. Your spanners are cold to the touch. The work you do, even if you're using an electric grinder, it's blowing air out from it, and that air is going to be really quite chilly on you. So working conditions in there weren't great, and hopefully it will be greatly improved by the new cladding. But the work that we've done, which includes a crane and so on that we'll see shortly, that's cost us this year the best part of £500,000 to reclad that. The works were completely empty for 16 weeks. There was scaffolding all down this side, scaffolding the far side, but when we go back in from the other end with the painted floor and everything, we've got an absolutely top-notch working environment now. So let's carry on up this way, please.
Brake shoes.
Brake shoes. Well done, young man. Brake shoes. So I've just paused here to talk a little bit about cast iron, because all of this stuff here is cast iron, and yeah, that is a brake shoe off a locomotive. Now,
Very heavy.
I can carry it, but I tell you, I wouldn't want to carry this as far as that container, never mind into the loco yard. So when we have to change brake shoes, that means the loco is in the pit, somebody is stood in the pit, and they're trying to have to lift something of that size up around the wheel. Somebody's outside ready to put the pit locating pin in, so on. Where's John gone? Oh, he's there. It's pretty hard graft, isn't it, reblocking?
Well, what you don't see is there's a hole got to be drilled in there. So
Yeah.
we
Those
don't
haven't got the
drill
holes.
it now because we don't know which engine it may end up on, because engines have different size pins. So you drill that, as you see, that one's got a hole in it. Those other ones will have to have the hole drilled in. And sometimes it depends on the...
And a lump of cast iron like that casting, you're looking at £120 each for those. Fire bars, so the locomotive grate on which the fire sits is made up of a load of fire bars, either long bars like that, which are all laid in parallel, and you might have 2 or 3 sets of them in a grate, or smaller fire bars, what we call fingers, and these fit on a bar, and then from within the cab the driver and fireman can actually rotate them to shake the ashes and clinkers out. On a flat grate like that, the poor fireman and driver at the end of the day have to get what's called a clinker paddle, which is a shovel about 10 foot long, and have to shovel all the ashes out. Cast iron is actually far better when it's had chance to weather, and so hence we store this outside. We used to store it inside, but in the new shed we said, right, we'll build a compound for it here, we've got more cast iron still to move in here. If a brake block is £120, a fire bar about that size, you're probably looking about £80, and the locomotive grate could have 60 of those in it, maybe more. So a grate, just the fire grate in the locomotive, you could be looking at £4,000–5,000, and they're consumable items.
Are they sourced over here or are they Chinese?
Oh, these are sourced here in the UK.
Okay,
yeah. See, that's got some numbers on it. It says SVR12 and AW04.
Yeah.
Down the back lane, we have a little workshop down there, our pattern shop, where we have volunteers who spend all of their time making, refurbishing, modifying wooden patterns that get sent off to the foundry. So that has been made by a pattern maker, AW, Andy Williams, and that was his 4th pattern. Andy Williams is up to the hundreds of patterns that he's made now in our pattern register.
Long-serving member.
Yes, and that would be a very simple pattern, but something like this, where it has to have gaps in the middle, that's what they, for the foundry, it has what's called a core box. So as it's, when you've got to make, the moulder has to make a sand mould out of the wooden pattern, and then they pour in the hot metal. So patterns can become quite complex when they've got cores in them. The other fascinating thing to my mind, I don't know how these pattern makers work it out, because this is simple. Some of the valves and things are really complex. Cast iron shrinks at 1/16 of an inch per foot, per 12 inches. So how tall's this? What, about 4 foot, say? So the pattern is built 1/4 of an inch longer than the finished article. Because if this was 1/4 of an inch too short, it might fall through the grate. If it's 1/4 of an inch too long, it means that some poor soul's got to get an angle grinder and grind 1/4 of an inch off it. So the pattern maker, they even have rulers which are out by that adjustment factor. They keep them separate from their ordinary rulers, but it's absolutely fascinating. We could probably spend an hour in the pattern shop alone just talking about patterns. Okay, so we'll carry on moving this way. So we're going to pause here by what probably looks to be a very scruffy builder's yard. Fire lighting. Fire lighting. I don't know whether it ever happened to John, but it certainly happened to me on a locomotive footplate. Somebody's had a look and seen our massive hot fire, and they say, "How do you light that?" And it's a match. That's, but a lot of wood, so old pallets and so on. A lot of coal, some oily rags and a match. That's how you light the fire, but this is why we have stacks of firewood around the place. We get through tons of this a year. Not for bonfire night, no.
Got a question about those pallets. Have you ever had them just burst into flames?
No. No.
It just seems like that amount of wood just sitting there.
Well, somebody who was very naughty might come along and try and set light to them, but fortunately that's never happened. I'm going to talk a little bit about coal, but I can see you're all distracted. If you want to get a picture, and then I'll talk about coal. what we'll do, because they're going to come and start up the coaling machine, we go round the corner, then I'll talk about coal, whilst we can watch the activity taking place.
That is amazing.
If we'll come and congregate here, we'll be far enough away. Right, you might be coming close because it's going to get a bit noisy by the sounds of it. Right, coal. I'm surprised nobody's already asked a question about coal because we hear it a lot on the news. Before COVID, we were burning 2,000 tonnes of coal a year on 7 lorry trains. We were paying about £125 a tonne, so that was about £250,000 per annum on our basic raw material for our grind steam service. Anybody hazard a guess what we pay for coal now? About double. Treble. £375 a tonne. So that's an extra £500,000 a tonne that comes straight off our bottom line. Now we're not burning 2,000 tonnes a year because one of the reasons why we're running more diesel this year, not because we can't get coal, it's just purely because it's costly. We can get coal, we've never actually run out of coal. So earlier in the year when coal was in short supply, everybody was saying we were going to run out. We managed to source about 300 tonnes, which we stockpiled. So if you travel on the railway, you go through Highland, you might see some wagons if you've got coal. That's just how to keep it reserved, stockpiled. The coal at the back of the car, if you notice when we walk past it, the coal at the back is smaller than the coal at the front. The coal at the back is coated. The coal at the front is the latest coal we're getting. It comes from Kazakhstan. I don't even know where Kazakhstan is, but it's down in the world. Now, running steam locomotives is pretty things to do. Black smoke, carbon and all the rest of it. And I actually have some fundamental principles. My other hobby outside of getting filthy dirty here is actually, I've got an allotment and I grow vegetables, chemical free. Because I've got those dreams eventually. But can anybody explain to me how shipping coal from Kazakhstan or Colombia into Britain is greener than digging it here and burning it ourselves? It is mad, but that's a mad world. So that's the coal situation. It's not that we can't get it, it's that we're currently paying £375 our coal suppliers have told us that by the end of the year, it'll be 500. Okay, we're going to move this way. It'll be a bit quieter.
The Welsh coal, yeah.
Well, the Welsh coal, they quoted us £500 a tonne. So we're not going to pay 500 if we get it imported at 375. Yeah, I know they found it. The first group found it as well. Right. So this locomotive, you might have seen it in the newspapers. You might even have seen it on the Now show on BBC One. Normally, it has the name Tor Valley. It's a Southern Railway what's called the West Country Pacific. They were all named after places in the south and southwest of England. So Barnstaple, Bodmin, this is called Tor Valley. But this year, in honour of the late Queen's Platinum Jubilee, we decided we would paint it purple, which was the Platinum Jubilee colour. If you noticed on the tender, it's got the Platinum Jubilee logo on it, and we numbered it 70 in honour of Queen Elizabeth's 70 years on the throne. Now, it's a proper Marmite job, this. You either love it or hate it. When the Severn Valley Railway Managing Director said to me, Martin, we want to paint Tor Valley purple. I was like, you're crazy. I think it's a balmy idea. But she and the marketing guys said, no, we want to paint it purple. They told me what we wanted to do. Because purple was the colour of the Commonwealth Games as well. And this loco hauled the train that carried the Games baton between Kidderminster and Bridgnorth. So she twisted my, well, she didn't twist my arm, she told me. I didn't have the chance to veto it. She told me we're painting it purple. I was completely against the idea. I thought it was balmy, but from the moment the purple paint appeared on it, I fell in love with it. So, I think it's fantastic, and it's going to be repainted into green, so it's not a permanent thing. Who else thinks it's fantastic? Who hates it? You are allowed to hate it, don't worry. You're allowed to hate it, because there's no right or wrong answer on this. There's no right or wrong answer. Severn Valley Railway got a massive amount of publicity from it, but it's not exactly heritage, is it? So you are allowed to hate it, and I'm not going to criticise you for hating it one moment.
I think I'll leave it that colour now.
So you think we should leave it this
Leave
colour?
that colour now, yeah. That's the one with the green, isn't it?
Well, it was of course named Elizabeth II.
Yeah.
The nameplates have gone. They've only been taken off this morning.
Yeah.
But that's because they're nice shiny brass nameplates with a red background. They will be going back on, but they're going to be painted with a black background.
Yeah.
We're going to run, it'll have some black flags on the front. Talking with the painter, he's thinking of doing something on the cab side to turn it into more of a memorial rather than a celebration. I'm not sure I'd agree whether we should keep it. It's going to remain purple for the rest of this year. It's actually due some major mechanical work which will be done this winter, and at the time that's done we'll repaint it into green would be the expectation. The paintwork, by the way, we'll have a look at some more paintwork in a minute, but all of our locomotives are brush painted by hand. Wow, yes, wow. Okay, so we'll head round to the other side. Gather round a minute, so we can talk about it, and you'll have a minute or two to take photos of that. So, what I would say is, please don't touch it, because although the paint is finished, the varnish is still hardening, and when it gets dirty, if you touch it, you can scratch the varnish. So, this is Great Western Railway number 4930. A Collet Hall class locomotive. When the noise is finished up there, we'll move up, you can see the nameplate. It's named Hagley Hall, and it is named after Hagley just down the road. Folklore legend call it what you will has it that the reason why the Severn Valley bought it was because of Hagley Hall just down the road. I haven't got time to tell you the full story, but there's quite a lot of fact in that. So this loco came out of the famous Barry scrapyard. It was restored here at the Severn Valley Railway. It ran in the 1970s, 1980s. It came out of use in 1986, and it was officially relaunched yesterday after 36 years being out of use. It will be hauling its first public passenger trains starting from Thursday next weekend's gala weekend. So let's move along a bit so as you can see it in a bit more of its splendour. So if you look really closely at it and see how the sun is on it, you will see that it is hand painted by brush. All the lining on it is all applied by hand. No masking tape, no masking tape. The painter, he has a very thin brush with bristles about that long, and he has his little rest thing, and he does it all by hand. They do sometimes put a chalk line. They get a piece of string, run a chalk along it, twang the string, which gives them a chalk line. What are you pointing out?
Fingerprints.
The fingerprints.
Fingerprints. Oh,
Somebody's
yeah.
fingerprints.
Oh yes, yes, there is fingerprints.
They shall be yesterday.
That's just oil, fortunately, which and you know, the sad thing is, I mean, nobody's going to say it looks anything other than magnificent, don't they?
Yeah.
But this is going to be in use for 10 years, and it won't look anything like this in 10 years' time.
It looked like that one over there.
Look like that one over there. So, all painted by hand. Somebody's already pointed out that there's even lining on the brake gear. This has what's called the Great Western shirt button emblem. If you want to come and look at the tender. Move past so everybody can see the emblem there. So at different times, different years, the Great Western and all the railway companies, they changed their livery. Sometimes it would actually have Great Western painted down the side. Sometimes it would have GWR. It might have a fancy crest. This has got what we call the shirt button. It's like a little button, really. And when we said we were going to paint it in shirt button livery, a number of our fellow volunteers said, "Oh, that's a really boring livery. I mean, you know, it's only a little thing." Shirt button emblem means that brake gear gets lined out, the steps get lined out. It might sound boring, but the painter said, "What? I've got to do that livery because there's a load more work to do." It's not just the painting, it's all the rubbing down and flatting down. The GWR, that is gold leaf. It's about £150 worth of gold leaf each side. Do you know what gold leaf is, young man?
Thin little strips of
Very thin strips, yeah, very thin strips. So, fantastic paint job. The guy who painted this is 22 years old. He's worked here as a volunteer since about the age of 14. And apart from he's obviously got a natural talent, he was taught the finer points by more senior volunteers who've been doing it for 40, 50 years. But if he can paint to this standard at the age of 22, what's he going to be like in 10, 20 years' time?
He's got a steady hand on like the elders about.
He's got a steady... Well, you say the steady hand. One of the more elderly guys, this is true, he's been painting locos for decades, and he always used to say that his best lining came in the afternoon because he'd been to the pub and had a few beers, which steadied his hand. Not nowadays, he don't drink in the middle of the working day nowadays. But yeah, Hagley Hall, these steam locos are phenomenally expensive to maintain and overhaul. The black one behind us, 75069, Last overhaul that had, which was 2.5 years, finished 2.5 years ago, £840,000. This one, bearing in mind both of these locos have run on the railway before, £1.4 million to overhaul this time. I can tell you that the paid staff spent 33,000 man hours on it. Volunteers between 12 and 15,000 man hours. £1.4 million. So if anybody ever says those 790 tickets, they're ever so expensive, they have to pay for overhauls like that. In fact, if you want to take some pictures of it, we'll pause for a minute. Please, when you come down this side, take a picture. Don't fall in the ditch, because I have to do a lot of paperwork. Right, you're in the shop. Besides the pit, if you want to get a better angle.
It's not a cheap, it's not a cheap.
Yeah, I forgot to point out that
When you think about what we did years ago, it's what we did.
Yeah, well, the long tube.
And all of a sudden,
Yeah. Right, we will now step out of the yard into the works.
Watch the pit over there as well.
Now, is it you, sir, who said you've been in the works, in the shed many years ago?
Yeah, a long time ago, yeah.
Do you remember what it was like then?
Well, I remember you can walk around the trains and
Walk around the yard.
Am I a bit late to ask a question? What does that do? It's in front of the cylinder. It's on the one side, but not on the other.
Oh, that's the vacuum pump for creating the vacuum for the brakes. Great Western had vacuum pumps fitted on their engines. We have ejectors to create the main big vacuum, but it's when it's running, that is what. That's there is the pump.
Back and forth.
Creates a vacuum. So that's the running vacuum. Yeah, next weekend. All being well, yes.
The floor.
Maybe one or two days as well.
This slab of floor is completely new. This used to be about 4 inches lower. It matched the rail level out there, so we've raised this up. All of the lighting is new. All the old lighting, very inefficient, power hungry. These are all absolute state-of-the-art LED, low voltage LED lights. Those lights up there are 48 volts. The power comes in, 240 volt comes in into a transformer and control unit, and thus it's low energy, low voltage up there. Low voltage is really useful to us in the engineering environment because it's low voltage, it's lightweight, thin cables. If we'd got 240 volt, we'd be having to have far thicker industrial strength armoured cables and so on. So brings us big advantages. We don't need the lights on. On a day like today, we absolutely don't need the lights on. But the lights, it's quite a fancy control system. And some people have said, ooh, fancy control system in a dirty environment like yours. But the company who installed all of this, we had to purchase the lighting units, and our electricians installed the cables, but everything else has been provided as a donation by the lighting company. The chap who owns the lighting company is a shareholder and supporter of the railway. And actually, we said to him, look, you can come and use us as a reference site, because they haven't actually used this style before in an industrial premises. There's lots of NHS places that they've done, ambulance stations, medical centres and so on. And you can program this stuff, so the lights can be programmed to come on at certain times. Single button will switch all the lights off. Individually, they're controlled in banks, so we can have some lights on and some lights off. Single button to switch everything off, and it's now integrated into the building alarm system. So when the alarm is set, it switches all the lights off, so that nobody can leave the lights on by mistake overnight. Similarly, first thing in the morning, the first guy who opens up disables the alarm, it puts one bank of lights on, so in the winter time, he won't be fumbling around trying to find a switch. He's got the lights on automatically. And you won't find him in the pit. Now the overhead crane, in the boiler shop, we've got a 30-ton crane, so we can lift boilers and so on in there. We've only got 6.3-ton crane, but part of the reason for that is we haven't got the headroom to have anything very much bigger. We've squeezed the maximum headroom we can out of that crane. We will use that for lifting things on and off locomotives, chimneys, cabs. We'll use it for moving stuff around in here. I was talking to, it was actually Al Howitt, John, I was talking to yesterday. And he was a chap who used to volunteer here. He's well retired now. But I said to Al, one of the most dangerous things we used to do was move locomotive wheel sets about. Yep. Those on the hall, they're 6 foot diameter. They've got big balance weights. And John will know it takes 5 of you to get it.
When the balance weight goes over.
And when the balance weight goes over, that wheel runs away. Probably the most dangerous thing we do. How nobody's crushed their foot, broken an arm or whatever, I don't know. Those days are gone, because I'll talk about the wheel drop in a minute, but if we have a set of wheels on an axle and we need to move it now, we'll just use the crane. There'll be no more rolling wheel sets about. Even things like that spring that's on the ground over the far side, that will have been changed in this pit here. To get it out of the pit, we used to, 4 or 5 of you, manual handling. Now we've got a crane that can do it. So the crane will not only speed things up, it will improve the health and safety in the place enormously. So I've just mentioned the wheel drop. That's what this thing is. So young man, beneath you is a hole 5 metres deep. Well, you haven't jumped off the plates, so that means that you're okay with the head for heights or whatever. What is a wheel drop? Basically, where this wooden platform is, there's a gap in the rails there. Gap in the rails there, similar on the other side. We can position a locomotive on here, take all the suspension, the brakes and the fastenings off. The control gear is over there. We can lower a single set of wheels into this pit. As it lowers in, some temporary rails automatically come into their place. We then tow the locomotive off with the wheels missing, repeat the process, bring the wheels back up from the pit, and you end up with a set of wheels here with its bearings and axle box and so on, if we needed to do some repair work on it. We also use this for adjusting the weights on a locomotive, replacing a spring, like that one over there. We used to do that sort of stuff with manual hydraulic jacks and wooden packing. This is an awful lot safer. So this came from a railway depot in Leicester. One of our volunteers spent all his working life working on the railway at Leicester, and he heard that they were going to get rid of this wheel drop. They were going to scrap it. So we negotiated with them through this volunteer friend of ours, and we bought it for £8,000. But it then cost £300,000 to get it out of the ground in Leicester, overhaul it, refurbish it, and dig a whopping great big hole here with tens of tons of concrete and reinforcing to actually form the basis for this and then install it. So you're looking at £300,000 worth, but it's probably paid for itself twice over. in terms of speeding jobs up, safety. We've even had steam locomotives from other heritage places come here to borrow this piece of equipment so as they can do some running maintenance on their locos. I say borrow, we charge them for the privilege, but those of you who might be rail enthusiasts, it was Royal Scot that came here to have some work done using our wheel drop. So that's how we drop a single set of wheels out. We'll talk in a minute or two about how we take all the wheels out and about how we get them into that wheel lathe in the machine shop, because it's not necessarily straightforward, is it, from where we're stood? Now let's move on down this way. We're still fitting out in here, by the way. The contractors had the building to do all the work, digging the footings, recladding, erecting the crane and so on, May through till August. So we've been back in here for little more than 3 weeks, and we're just bringing the stuff back. Some of us were talking about spanners earlier on. There's a fair size of spanner rack over there. Have you seen that, young man, over there, the size of our spanners? Right, so what we've got here is poor little 813. 813 is 121 years old and was, until spring this year, in full working order. It was actually operating in April, and it suffered a fairly major failure. You look just underneath, behind the firehole door here, you'll see a jagged piece. That's a casting that actually broke, and that's probably about an inch and an eighth cast iron, but that casting runs all the way back as far as there, and about 3'6" between the frames. So that's a sizable casting. And that happened just as we were emptying this shed for the contractors. So we couldn't actually bring it in and use our equipment to try and strip it down, because what we've got to do is remove that casting. So next week, 813 will be going on to the jacks. We've already removed some rivets and things, but we'll drop out this set of wheels, take out all the other rivets and so on, remove that broken casting. It's not just broken, it's now got a massive crack right down the middle of it. And then we have to try and work out how we're going to repair it. Now, it was built by a company called Hudswell Clark in 1901, and fortunately, I'm told, there are still some drawings around of this class of locomotive. I do joke that Hudswell Clark provided a massive 120-year warranty, but like everything you buy, it broke the year after the warranty ran out. Okay, so we're nearly finished now. In amongst this refurbishment that we've done, we've installed some new fume extraction equipment for our welding and fabrication area. You can see the telescopic arms, the pipes. Outside there's actually a fan and an extractor vent. I won't go into the details of why this bit of floor didn't get painted along with everything else, but it has now been painted, and next week, once the paint's hardened off, 813 will be coming on here, and these yellow things are screw jacks. There's a beam beneath those temporary rails there. That beam comes up at the back of the engine. This beam will lift the front of the engine. We can lift the engine into the air, take out those wheels. We'll probably take all the wheels out actually to examine them. To get the wheels on the wheel drop, it simply runs, we roll the wheels forward, and then there's a little turntable there that they can go through a wooden door into the wheel lathe where there's a 5-ton crane to lift them onto the wheel lathe. So I spoke in the machine shop about the First World War lathe. Well, these lifting jacks, they're pre-Second World War. The jacks are 85 years old, and we've owned them for far longer than London Transport did. But these 4 jacks between them can lift 60 tons. So 60 tons, Hagley Hall out there, if we left the tender in the yard and if we drained the boiler down and so on, we could bring Hagley Hall in here and lift it, leaving the wheels behind. When they've got the boiler on and they're way up in the sky, they're pretty impressive looking things. Okay, so there's one more thing we will talk about before we finish. Locomotive 82045. British Railways standard class 3 tank locomotive. Everything you see before you is brand new. This is what we call a new build locomotive. British Railways built 45 of these, number 82000 through to 82044. When British Rails got rid of steam locomotives, every one was scrapped. None of them ended up in the Barry scrapyard where most of our locomotives originated from. And about 20 plus years ago, a group of people said this sort of locomotive would be the ideal locomotive for a heritage line. This sort of locomotive ran on the Severn Valley branch in British Rail days. So they decided that they would start raising funds to build a new one. This is their achievements to date, plus a lot more. They've got a lot more components for this. The boiler for this is currently being assembled in our boiler shop, a brand new boiler. By the time it's finished, probably be maybe £2.5 million. But it'll be brand new. And this is where I sit firmly on the fence, because it's going to be a brand new locomotive. The thinking being that after it's run for 10 years and comes due its first heavy overhaul, it'll need relatively little doing to it compared to a 60, 70, Hagley Hall's nearly 100 years old. 813 is 120 years old. We won't actually find out until about 2034, because my expectation is actually it will need probably about as much work doing to it as an existing locomotive. That's just my thought. Might need a little less. I admire very much what they've achieved, and when it's finished I look forward to being able to drive it. But for the money it will cost to build a new one, you could go into the Engine House Museum in Highley and probably choose 2, maybe even 3 locomotives to overhaul them. That black one outside, 75069, I said cost £840,000. For £2.5 million you could do more or less 3 of those. So is it better to spend the money on restoring an original, or is it better to spend the money on making a new? This will be an incredibly useful locomotive. I admire what they're doing, but is it heritage? I'm not sure. It will become heritage. It will run on a heritage line, but it's a facsimile. But having said that, who around here has seen Tornado, the big Pacific locomotive? Yeah, it's not an original steam loco, but it's about the most fantastic loco I've ever been on here. I've had the privilege to be on it because they've modernised it. It's got LED lighting. It's got all sorts of gizmos that the original never had. But is it heritage? No, it's not heritage. So we're here talking about Heritage Open Day. 813 4930 a heritage. This is the younger generation's heritage. It will be heritage. It will haul heritage coaches on our heritage line. That line, incidentally, John said when we were talking about costs outside, we're only talking about the cost of locomotives. Carriages can cost £100,000 to overhaul. Severn Valley Railway, 16 miles long. In that 16 miles, we've got 2 tunnels, 5 viaducts, a bridge over the River Severn, and for 12 of its miles, it runs in a river valley that's always prone to slippage. If you were going to choose somewhere to build a heritage railway or have a heritage railway today, you would not choose the Severn Valley line, but it's where we are. Yes, sir?
With building that from new, have they learnt anything that helps them when they're overhauling another one?
No, other than the guys who are building it are now more experienced than they were when they started. So they will be better, because it's all volunteers.
I was always told if you built something, you'll know better how to repair it.
You're right in that respect, because the guys who've done it are all volunteers. So when they machine that, if they now need, in 7 years' time, to repair that, assuming they're still with us because they're mostly pensioners, they will have, you're right, they will have a better job because they will understand what they did to build it.
I was reading an article on Trackside the other day, and the guys who built Tornado are now doing the P2, and they say the experience they got from doing Tornado got them into this new building, and they learned by certain mistakes that the order to build things and do things. So but
it's no different to overhauling a loco. If you overhaul one, you'll learn the errors and mistakes that you made, and you'll take that into the next. And I've been here as a volunteer for 46 years. The original shed was just being constructed when I started as a volunteer. The guys that I learnt off, and I'm not an engineer, as I said right at the outset, the guys that I learnt off, some of them are no longer with us, some of them are long since retired, perhaps less mobile than they were. One of the big problems that Heritage all around the globe has, not just railways, but stonemasons, millwrights, that sort of thing. The problem that we have is passing that on to the new generations. We run an apprentice scheme here, so we have 16, 17, 18-year-old apprentices who they do their couple of days a week at college, but the rest of the time they're in here doing work on our Heritage loco fleet, because we've recognised that we're not going to be able to go out and find, you can't today go out and find somebody who's worked on one of these for a living. They're all retired now, so we're having to train them up, and the best way of training them up is from people who've done it before. Any other questions?
Is that owned by Severn Valley or an outside company?
It's done by a group called the 82045 Trust, who are doing all the work themselves. They are all volunteers, and they're based here at Severn. It doesn't belong to Severn, but it's Severn Valley Association. When did this? 20 odd years ago. About 2024. But when I say they started it, they had nothing. They absolutely had nothing other than a big stack of drawings. So they went out and ordered the frame plates. I remember the frame plates coming. And then they ordered the frame stretchers which hold the plates together. Then they had to drill the holes, bolt it together, check it was right, replace the bolts with rivets. Then they had the frames. Then they got the wheels. Then they had to get the axle boxes, the bearings. Eventually they reached the point where they could put the frames onto the wheels. Then they could start putting all of this stuff on. If you look on YouTube, there is film of this piece here being cryogenically fitted to that shaft. Cryogenic fitting means that shaft was immersed in a tub of liquid nitrogen at minus 200 degrees centigrade. Shrunk it, that was heated up, that's why it's discoloured. The two were put together, that cools, that expands. You'd need a heck of a press to get that off there now. But there's a video of that on YouTube. Part of the learning that you were talking about.
It's one of the first uses of the crane, wasn't it?
No, it was done in the boiler shop.
Oh, it was done in the
boiler shop, yeah. So, yeah, I'm gobsmacked that they're doing that. This has only been inside for about 12, 18 months. Most of the work they did was on a concrete pad outside.
Is the piston inclined like that, the cylinder, is that more powerful like that?
It's not necessarily more powerful. I'd have to read up lots of books to see why. Some locos have them inclined, some have them parallel. It's not more powerful just because it's inclined, isn't it? Okay, let's make our way through the door. head back to where we started from. We've overrun, well, John's not going to struggle to get a cup of tea.
Oh, don't worry.
Patent door stopping. Come on round, up onto the platform.
Yes, I do, yeah.
I wouldn't pass out to safety.
Still got a steel toe cap in it.
Well, we got too far forward. Shouldn't do, but
Right. Oops. So that's it, ladies and gents.
Very much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for booking on it. Thank you for your interest. Please come back and see us again.
Oh yeah.
We're probably not going to have the sheds open next year, but we might open the carriage workshops instead. But look out, if you just mind clear the platform because this is going to move. Going backwards. Anyway, enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.